very much, David, and it is indeed a real honour and a very humbling position to stand here today, because I know how significant this award is, because I've sat for the last 6 years and listened to the previous recipients, most of whom I think, or many of whom are in this room. Last week it was a bald man with glasses. This year it's another tall bald man with glasses. There's Paul sitting next to Margaret. Thank you very much for that introduction. That's really kind, David. But as David alluded to, I came here in 2005 for a very particular reason, and that's because the values of the Burnet Institute are exactly the values that I adhere to. We have a logo that says medical research and practical action, and to my mind that really epitomises the work of the Institute, and particularly the centre which I now work in, the Centre for International Health. And in this lecture, what I'd like to do is refer a little bit back to the work that I've done in the past. Brendan said to me when he told me I'd be giving the award, he said, "This is about you, and I might not be much, but I'm all I think about," as someone once said. And I will refer to some of my work, and I will refer to some publications, but in fact, it's all about partnership. Anything we ever do in this field is around partnerships and collaborations. I just want to make that clear. Yes, the award is to me, but it's also to all the people that I've worked with throughout my career. So the title, I wanted to drag you in the drugs and sex sort of theme. I thought I'd get a bigger audience, but at the same time I also want to talk about the relationship that is fundamental to the Institute between research and development, and particularly in the context of international health. Much of what we do is within that nexus, and within the Centre for International Health we have an ongoing debate about the balance between the sort of work that David spoke about, our traditional development work, and how research fits into that paradigm. These are the kind of questions that come up. We had a planning day in July where one of the main themes was research and development, where we discussed that at length, and these were some of the questions that came up, and in the time I've got speaking this afternoon, I'll touch upon these questions. As David said, before I came to Burnet, I was at London University. My career did start off very much in an academic research environment. But as the years passed by, I became more and more involved in direct development and direct intervention activities. And the kind of research that I've really engaged in throughout that time and into my time at the Burnet has been the sort of formative research. You know, if you don't know what's happening in this scenario or a situation, you know, what are the data that we need to collect? Operational research, how do things work? And then the implementation research, how can we sustain evidence-based interventions once we've assessed and evaluated them? But before I bring you up to date, I want to go back a little bit into the past. I want to go back to the very early days of harm reduction. I've realised if you stay in this field long enough, you can say 30 years ago, which was a bit frightening the first time I ever heard someone say that, but it's possible. So nearly 30 years ago, I was a very young researcher in a very formative environment. It became apparent that HIV was linked to injecting drug use. So I remember exactly the moment that occurred to me. I was working in a crisis intervention centre in London, and one of the drug users said, "What is this HTLV3, I think it was called at the time. What is this all about, and how does it relate to injecting drug use?" I was a researcher working on a Department of Health funded research project looking at the reasons why there were not sufficient outreach services for drug users, and we were immediately asked, can you start collecting data about risk behaviour in injecting drug use? It was also a very politicised time, although we were able in London, as you are here in Australia at the time, we were able to implement needle syringe programs. In other parts of the world this wasn't the case at all, and I had the privilege of spending quite considerable time over those 8 years in the States working on outreach programs. Although there weren't needle syringe or harm reduction interventions available, there were ethnographers that were collecting data and understanding the risks so that we could use those data to help to inform the politicians. Interestingly, Margaret Thatcher is often pilloried, but it's a little known fact that it was she who actually signed off on the early harm reduction needle syringe programs in the UK, while Ronald Reagan, on the other hand, took quite a different view, and it took another nearly 10 years before there were needle syringe programs in the US. Now, at the same time, the United Nations and the WHO were getting involved and realising that we needed to understand scenarios in a range of countries across the world. And some of my earlier engagements with intervention development were through these rapid assessment programs. And one of the early lessons that I learned was the place of research and development, that often it wouldn't be necessarily the priority, and that really it was about appreciating how the formative research and the operational research could feed into policy and practice, and that although, as David said at the beginning, you know, we do aspire to peer-reviewed articles and publications. At the same time, in those early days, much of that early research fed into drug policy, into strategies, and even just into international debates, as was the case in Egypt. And I think that's a lesson that we often have to debate in the Centre for International Health, that there may well be opportunities to do formative and situational assessment research, but it may not always lead to the kind of publications that we desire. Now, at the same time, we then had some solid research that gave us some very good evidence around harm reduction that would enable us to move on to the sort of operational research that would help us to evaluate interventions. The WHO conducted a multi-city study where they looked at a number of cities around the world, some of which had intervened with harm reduction activities early on in the epidemic, and others which hadn't. So Sydney, Amsterdam, London, where there were early interventions with needle syringe programs, were compared against other cities such as New York, Santos, Rome, Madrid, where there hadn't been that early intervention, just to show early on the impact of intervening with injecting drug users. At that time, we were also able to look at some of the nuances of behaviour, and for me, it opened up to me the importance of ethnographic and anthropological research in development. We were able to adhere to the protocols for this study, but we also added on an ethnographic component and looked at the ways in which people were also using the paraphernalia around injecting. So it wasn't just the needles and syringes that caused the high risk, but also the uses of the cottons and the water and the other mixing materials. So there was an opportunity to have some really solid evidence that we could take to the next phase, which would be the operational research phase. And the lessons that I learned here were actually, if you're working in a development context, the research has to find its place. The example I'd like to give is in Sverdlovsk, which is one of the oblasts of Russia, of the former Soviet Union. We were invited by the Department for International Development in the UK to be the academic partner, but the request had come directly from the Ministry for Health in Sverdlovsk, a man called Dr. Halfin, who's now a minister in the central government in Russia. He noted through some of the epidemiological studies that in Sverdlovsk, the prevalence of HIV amongst injecting drug users was twice the national figures, and he went directly to DFID and said, could we help? Now, the reason I mention this particular study, because what it showed for me was that research has to find its place in development, that research may only be one component of that activity. And if you look at the list of project partners there, excuse the acronyms, we've got Medicine Sans Frontières, Medicine du Monde, Open Society Institute, International Family Health with the management company. We had collaboration of partners with a whole range of ministries, both at the national and the local level. And there were we, University College London, partnering with the Urals Medical Academy just for one component of the activity itself. So the research component was purely contained within the monitoring and evaluation component of the research. Just as an aside, another really important context, the importance of understanding context in any of our development work, with a breakdown of the Soviet Union, there was the vacuum was filled by the Russian mafia, and the Uralmash mafia in Sverdlovsk were very anti-harm reduction. So as well as trying to implement this program, as well as trying to conduct some monitoring evaluation, we had to contend with very, very powerful criminal group which were trying to undermine the work that we did. So development always has nuances of context. Now, we were able in that particular work to collect some good data. We studied risk behaviour amongst a baseline of drug users before we got into the intervention, and we compared those three time periods to look at the impact of the needle syringe exchange programs. And part of that operational research was to look at the viability of fixed sites versus mobile sites, which was an issue for us back in the UK. Although we did manage to get a good publication out of this, I think the greatest value of this work was at the behest of the Ministry for Health. We had a dissemination conference where 47 mayors, I remember it very well, 47 mayors from the Oblast, which is the administrative district in Russia, attended the conference. And by showing them that one particular slide and talking to that one particular slide, 50% of them, about 20, in fact no, 25 of those mayors committed to 4% of their health budget for harm reduction in the next round of budgeting. There were also that we used those data to bring around legislative changes. There were two articles of the Russian law, Article 47 and 48, which embedded on my mind, which were around paraphernalia laws. And as a result of the work we did in Sverdlovsk, we were able to repeal those and amend that piece of legislation. And in terms of research into practice, we were given this bus here. We talked about having a mobile needle syringe program, and the mayor was the coach company in Sverdlovsk owed the mayor a heap of money, which he was not able to pay. So he gave us this old bus, which over a period of time we modified and turned into a mobile needle syringe program, and that's. The lady in the middle there was a doctor from the Oblast, a narcologist from the Oblast, who, as far as I know, is still out there driving the bus around. Now, at the same time, I myself was getting very involved and interested in development work, and particularly the Institute for Development Studies down at the University of Sussex in England, and looking at ways in which we could use participatory methods more. In a more engaged way in our research work. At that time, we'd moved from monotherapy into antiretroviral therapies and combination therapies. There were a huge number of issues around that were outside my own sphere at the time of injecting drug use, and we began to look at the potential for using some of the intervention methods around peer interventions and peer-driven interventions, which were very prominent in the harm reduction movement at the time in other areas. One area that was particularly effective was working with the Big Issue Foundation and using the vendors that you see on the streets as peer educators, particularly around hepatitis C. And unbeknownst to myself, we were developing a settings approach that I know Mike and others in the Centre for International Health were expounding here. I used this particular example because we engaged in very closely with a partnership with a group called Gay Men Fighting AIDS, who were actually peers themselves, and it was based in a sex venue in Hampstead Heath in North London, which any gay man who ever goes to London will find themselves in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s on Hampstead Heath, because it was a place where many men went to meet others. And at the time they were developing this and delivering this intervention, we also were conducting this research project. Part of the intervention was to have a litter collection, because there was a concern from other people who used the heath, all the litter that was left around the sex venue, and every month there was a collection of detritus and materials that were left behind. And one of the issues, one of the research questions was, were these individuals using the materials that were being provided by the project, by the Gay Men Fighting AIDS? And I had one of those moments of methodological innovation, I would call it. I think we collected all the litter from the venue into black plastic bags, and I thought it'd be a great idea just to take one of these bags randomly. So it was a randomized trial here. Take one of these bags randomly, and then lay them all out, and actually measure and count everything that was in that bag, and that was the result of that. I put this here particularly for my wife Tanya, because this was our second date. I actually said, would she like to come on a picnic on Hampstead Heath? And when she was given the plastic gloves and told what she was doing, I thought, well, this will be a make or break date. I wouldn't recommend that necessarily to others, but it was a memorable day, and we're still here together, and with our son Louis sitting next to Tanya. Now, I like to give this example because I think it's important in that development context, which was there. That was in London, but it was in a particular context of thinking about how we could be innovative and use participatory methods that have come from development. And at that point of time, as I say, I was working with some colleagues in Sussex to look at ways in which we can use some of the participatory methods that have been used in development studies for many years to integrate into our more formal research approaches. And the next example I'd like to give, where we took this one step further, was within a randomized controlled trial that was looking at the effectiveness of a complex adolescent health intervention in Zimbabwe. And I used this particular example in my field methods teaching, because I do think it's a great example of how we talk about mixing qualitative and quantitative methods, but I think you can actually use quite innovative participatory methods even within the rigour of a randomised controlled trial. So and I won't spend too much talking about this particular study, but I'd just like to give you a flavour of it. This was a cluster randomised controlled trial. The outcomes were to reduce the incidence of HIV and herpes, reduce unintended pregnancies. There was a community randomised trial of 6,600 students across 30 communities. But what happened, there were discordant pilot results, that in fact they collected data asking people if they had sex or not, and some of the young women said they'd never had sex, but they ended up pregnant or having sexually transmitted infections. And it all came down to a cultural misunderstanding of what was meant by sex. But quite simply, in the Shona language, you don't say you've had sex until you've said you've slept on the mat. So you may have had sexual encounters before that, but their notion of sex is Sleeping on the Mat, which is about romantic love. So we were lucky enough, and this is the National Institutes of Health who don't often give funding for innovative qualitative research. We put in a bid to do some qualitative research that would actually give us some insight into the background to those discordant results, and then B, to use some of these participatory methods to help us understand better the reproductive health issues of these young people. And this is one example. We conducted a range of participatory approaches. We had workshops, we did risk maps, as you see there. We used some of the confirmatory methods around pairwise ranking, which I won't talk about now, but that's another participatory method. And then we collected a whole range of complex narratives around the experiences of young people around risk. And the development side of that was to have these participatory outcome meetings where we worked with the local communities to develop interventions. So what I'm trying to show here is the sort of move for myself personally, but also in terms of the relationship between formative and operational research. So you can use a wide range of research methods, and you can use an aim for a wide range of outcomes. The last activity for myself before coming here was to work with the China-UK HIV/AIDS programme for the Department of International Development, and again, for my own personal interest, it was moving more towards the development end of that spectrum than towards the research end. And as you see up in the right-hand corner there, we were using, what's left-hand corner of yours? No, it's the right-hand corner. We were using participatory methods to develop mapping around risk. Context, of course, is so important. That little picture on the left-hand side showed that although we were developing interventions and research around sex work and injecting drug use, there were a lot of crackdowns on both of those areas. So in 2005, I came here, so I'm bringing this up to the present now. I had to leave my two older sons behind. I was hoping that they would follow me to Australia, but they decided that London and East End of London and the dreadful weather and etc. was where they wanted to be. But Tanya and Louis came, and there we are, now Australian citizens. Louis is a lot bigger than that little Boy Scout there, but so I came here very specifically to work at the Burnet Institute. I'd known about the Burnet Institute for some time. I'd worked with Nick Crofts in harm reduction for 20 odd years up until now. I knew about the ethos of research and development. That's something that was very important to me, as I think I've described. And I was very aware of the importance of picking a team. I was hoping I'd be able to say something very positive about the Tigers. I was hoping I'd be able to say something like the main difference between Paul and I is that I barrack for Richmond and Carlton. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But one of the biggest challenges for me, as you'll see, is my son moved from Richmond to Carlton, and I'd say that in my period in Australia, that's been one of my own real sadnesses. But he did actually, as you see, he's there, the number 7 at the Bledisloe Cup. He played for Burundora under-10s rugby union, which I used to play myself, and he was the guard of honour at the Bledisloe Cup, and you can see the captain, whose name escapes me at the moment, another tall, bald-headed man running through there. Okay, so I didn't just choose one team, I chose most of them. And the only reason I didn't choose Melbourne Victory is because I'm a Tottenham Hotspur fan from way back, and it would be heretical. The other thing I did do, I did do some serious research around the Institute, and I remember reading this paper in 2003 back at University College London, and being incredibly impressed, and I say this in all seriousness, about the sort of work that was taking place here. And this is, for those of you who don't know, it was a study around nutrition, but part of the formative research showed that one of the main problems and concerns was lower back pain, and there was a physiotherapist involved. Damien Morgan was a physiotherapist involved in that study. And the simple but profound outcome was the happy back tap stand. So the before and after made a huge difference to the women. So sometimes, and the Lancet published this, sometimes the simplest solutions and the surprising solutions are the best. Now, what I'd just like to do now is to show, to talk a little bit about where we are. I'm going to, having done that sort of history run, I now want to just seat ourselves in the present and talk about the work that's being done in the Centre for International Health around those areas. I talked about formative research, I talked about operational research and implementation research. That second area, though, is incredibly important for us around research capacity development and how a huge part of our work is actually working with our partners. We have offices in Myanmar and PNG and Laos. We have work in countries all over the region, and part of our research activities and research impetus is developing research capacity within our partners. Now, in terms of a piece of formative research, which is also around capacity development, when I first arrived, we were in the middle of a really large and engaged piece of work looking at the situational assessment of illicit drug use across the whole Asia-Pacific region. So that was when the Centre for Harm Reduction was in existence here. And out of that piece of formative research came two things. One was the realisation that there was virtually no data in the Pacific on drug and alcohol. There was plenty of data around Asia, and quite clearly the main issue for Asia was injecting drug use that are linked for HIV, but there was very little work around the Pacific. So as a result of that, Burnet, or the Centre for Harm Reduction at the time, the Centre for International Health as is now, because Centre for Harm Reduction was subsumed into the Centre for International Health 4 years ago, we set up something called the Pacific Drug and Alcohol Research Network. And I mention this because it's had a huge impact and effect upon the research and the research capabilities in that region around this particular area of alcohol and drugs. And it's led to some really positive activities. We've had network meetings both in Melbourne and in the Pacific. We had to have the first one in Melbourne because it was through with the ISSS scheme, which was seated in Australia. But over the life of this network, we've done a wide range of capacity building. We've had ADRA grants, Australian Development Research Awards. We've conducted other situational assessments. We've worked at the advocacy level around some of the problems for the use of homebrew in the Pacific. And we've set up an intelligence and data sharing network through the website, but also funded and facilitated by the Australian National Council on Drugs. And to this day, the Burnet is the secretariat of that group. Now, more broadly, in terms of research capacity development, I'd like just to touch on some of our recent and current bilateral programs, because this is a huge part of our development work, as well as what many of you may understand by the Centre for International Health in terms of its work in our offices and in terms of its work in terms of focusing on marginalised populations and interventions around health issues. We do have a very strong research capacity development focus. So in our China-Australia Health facility, something like 60% of the 124 activities were research-based. And with our current PNG bilateral program, Health and HIV Information Service, amongst other things, amongst other activities, including operational and implementation research, we've been responsible for setting up and being a part of the establishment of the National Medical Research Body. In the audience somewhere is our team leader from Tibet. I can't see you, Tony, but Tony's here. There's a huge component of our work in Tibet which is on focusing on operational research. We're working with in a capacity building focus, but operational research and improving the activities of our partners is a major part of that. With the HIV Cooperation Programme for Indonesia that I'm the Programme Director of, every year we have a research grant facility where now to date we've had 214 research programmes in Indonesia, all of which are with partners in that country. In Laos, where we have our longest continuous country programme, a country office, we have research skills building there, most recently working with the Lao Youth Union around situational assessment, social and health situational assessment. And I really wanted to mention also that within our education and training work at CIH, our alumni and associates are very much a part of our research capacity. Now, in terms of where we are with operational research, we now, going back to the harm reduction world, we have a huge array of guidelines and evidence for action that we can use in terms of developing our research. And I thank Chad for a discussion around, for a discussion around where we are with operational research in Myanmar, because it's really important, I think, for us all to appreciate that we can actually have a very strong intervention program, but also include evidence-based research and develop operational research that can lead to publications and dissemination and then feedback into that global evidence. The other area that I'd just like to finish up on in terms of the current activities around implementation research, the WHO are full of guidelines and definitions. They've now got definitions that we can use to guide our implementation research. But in a way, this talks to us very well in terms of our development nexus, that it's around identifying implementation problems. It's around testing practical solutions, and it's around sustaining those within the health system. And probably one of the best examples that we've got, which also illustrates the importance of work across the Institute, where the development and international development research come together, is around the trial of the Visitect point-of-care CD4 testing, both through our Saving Lives at Birth Grand Challenges in Research and our NHMRC research. And I think it's important to note that the NHMRC research was cited as the top 10 funded of last year. So I think we've clearly got it right around following the guidelines for implementation research. And that's across, as you see, five countries. So more and more in the Centre for International Health, we're working across the other two centres. I mean, I could have spent a whole in the previous iteration of this presentation, I had to take something out, and I had all our work around local solutions and public injecting that we've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years with the Centre for Population Health. And that again is another good example where formative operational and implementation research come together to address a key issue. So just in the couple of minutes I've got left, because I was told 3:15 was my time. So there are, first of all, I put this up as challenges when I was busy putting my PowerPoint together last night. But I decided it's not challenges. I want to talk about resolution, because they're not challenges anymore. These are some of the issues that we do face when we work together as international development. An international development agency and also as a research institute. It's around process. But sometimes for researchers, the priority in one of our country offices or one of our country programs or one of the countries that we work on may not be your research question. So it's around working carefully within that context to ensure that, you know, the priorities of the national research strategy and our research priorities coalesce, and just to be mindful that sometimes the key questions we have may not be the key questions for our international partners, and there's always a point of collaboration and partnership there. An issue that that can confound us sometimes is around ethics. Often in our centre we'll be asked to conduct a piece of research work, you know, within 3 months or sometimes within 6 weeks. And I know there are a number of people in the audience here who are working to try to find a way to expedite that process, that, you know, we can't always wait for 3 months to go through the AMREP ethics procedure, and that what we need to do is to acknowledge that sometimes the need for expediency for our research work has to be addressed. And I know that ACFID and others in the room are looking at that. And then finally, the tricky one around metrics. I mean, Brenda will often say, and David said the same thing, how critical and important peer-reviewed publications are for us, and I absolutely agree with that. But then, as you'll have seen from some of the slides I showed, there are other outputs. There are outputs around policy, there are outputs around practice, there are outputs around guidelines. And when I left England 10 years ago nearly now, the Medical Research Council in the UK had just agreed that when you apply for your fellowship, then particularly work that has policy implications, whether that's at the local level or the national level, work around commissioned research reports would count with equal measure with the peer-reviewed articles. Now, what I'd like to suggest then, with Brendan as the president of the Australian Medical Research Institute and the new incoming NHMRC director, that we begin to think about maybe looking at ways in which some of the non-peer-reviewed outputs could be seen as important metrics. Now, finally, this is something that I'd just like to go back to those first 3 questions. I'm not going to answer them directly, but it occurred to me when I was looking at this this piece of work that we're just about to undertake, or undertaking in Papua New Guinea, that in fact the process from enabling governance, from putting processes in place right through to aiming for a research and training centre of excellence and all the points in between really address those 3 questions, because the first question is really about symbiosis. There's a symbiotic relationship between research and development. That, you know, how does development generate research questions? It's around the priorities. This request came directly from the Western Province government. They wanted a response. And what are the key aims of international development and research? Well, as David said from the very beginning, it's around improving health, and particularly for the Burnet, it's around improving the health of marginalised populations. So I'd like to suggest that, and I'd like to finish on a very positive note, that this is the sort of work that really brings together the researchers amongst us, the passionate development workers amongst us, and there's always opportunities with the Institute to put medical research into practical action. And just one final slide to summarise. I'll leave the last thought or the last word to Frank Fenner. Thank you very much.